Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. This is the third webinar in our Skills for the Future series, and today we're going to talk about listening. My name is Henriette and I will be facilitating the session today. Before we start, I will quickly run through how this webinar will work for those of you who haven't participated before. Our speaker today is the lovely Katie Columbus from Samaritans, and she will be talking to you for about 25 minutes, and you'll be able to follow along on your screen. And we'll move on to questions at the end. Don't worry if you missed anything, because we'll be sending you a recording of the session afterwards via email. You can ask questions at any time during the session. All you need to do is type it into the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. And questions are totally anonymous and they'll come to my screen only, so please feel free to contribute in complete confidence. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to our guest speaker today, Katie Columbus.
Hi everyone, I hope that you can hear me. We're in this very strange land of me just seeing my slides and hoping that everybody is really there. I'm Katie Columbus from Samaritans, where I work in communications, and during the pandemic I wrote a book called How to Listen, which I'm going to talk to you about today, and also talk to you about some of the principles of active listening that we use at Samaritans that formed the concept of the book. It's based on the active listening principles that we use at Samaritans. So when people call us in distress, we have a lot of training and a wheel of how we respond to people in distress, which the idea of the book really was to take all of those principles and transfer them into everyday conversations with friends, family members, partners, colleagues, neighbours. In that time when we were very physically distanced from one another, but we really needed to be connected, we needed that human connection with one another. It was about much more than talking to people in a distress, in a crisis situation. It was much more about imparting that practice just into everyday communication, how we listen to one another in a way that promotes each other's mental well-being. And it was made up of interviews from people who use the Samaritan service, and from volunteers, and from psychologists and specialists. And it was all stories of hope. People who have been through a really, really tough time across the entire spectrum of mental health and emotional well-being, all of whom found strength and hope to continue on, and to some of them actually became Samaritans volunteers after using the service. So it's a really inspiring book of stories from the Samaritans community. There are a few main principles that we use around how to be a better listener. I'll talk you through some of them, and then we have some tips that hopefully you can try and remember, and they can help you in everyday conversations with people that you know, just to promote better listening to one another and better conversation. And if anyone has any questions, please do feel free to ask. One of the main principles really is to give somebody your full time and your full attention. I think in the cut and thrust of day-to-day life, we're really busy. Before the pandemic, we were running for trains, we were commuting in and out of the office, we have busy social lives, we have work, family, friends, gym, all of these different things that we're juggling. So actually to have someone's time is quite a unique thing. So partly it's around giving someone the gift of your time, showing them that you're listening to them with intent. So putting away your phone, making really good eye contact, and focusing completely on the person that you're talking to so they feel heard. And I'll go through this in a couple of other areas, but one thing that might feel a bit uncomfortable sometimes is to sit down opposite somebody and like be really confrontational, look them in the eye and say, we need to talk. It can feel quite confrontational. Actually, you don't need to make it so confrontational and so direct. You can just sit next to somebody, you can go for a walk with somebody, you can go for a drive with somebody. You can do your best listening if somebody's doing the washing up and you're doing the dishes, because you're kind of engaged in different activity and you're not having to stare at each other. So the eye contact is an interesting one, because you do need to check in to reassure the person that you're listening. But if it feels too much, don't feel like you have to overdo it. Pauses are fine in a conversation. I think we often feel very uncomfortable if there is silence. my advice is to really work with that silence, let it happen, even when you think, oh, this feels really uncomfortable and really awkward, I need to jump in and say something. Actually, that pause can be where the other person is really formulating their next thought. And if you jump in and interrupt that can kind of knock them back and think, oh, actually, okay, I'm not going to say that because you've talked again. So let the pauses be there, make time to not feel like you have to fill that silence. The next thing is saying back what you've heard. So if someone says, I've had a really difficult day and it felt really dark, you might say to them, oh, you've said that feels dark. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? So you're using the language that they're giving you to lead you onto the next route in that conversation. So you're showing that you've heard what they're saying because you're repeating it back to them. They're then hearing what they've said, and they might hear it back in a slightly different way, which leads you into this place of a conversation where you can say, actually, I wonder what that means. Can we just dig a little deeper there and see, what did you mean when you said that? And it can kind of lead you on to elaborate. Well, actually, what does dark look like for you? What does it feel like for you? How might that manifest, and how can we try and ease that for you? Resist putting your interpretation on what you hear. Sometimes it's very easy to jump in and go, oh yeah, that happened to me. Let me tell you all about when that happened to me, because it sounds really similar, and suddenly you've taken the floor back. You've taken the power away from the person that wants to be heard and wants to talk, and you've made it all about you. So don't jump in, and sometimes it's good to use empathy and say, actually, yeah, that I kind of know how that feels, but can you tell me more, so that you're not taking up the floor space, as it were. Don't give up. It might be really difficult the first time, the second time, the third time to open up a conversation with somebody. It might feel tricky. It might take a few goes, but keep persisting. The first time, the person might think, oh, no, that feels difficult. I don't want to have to talk about this. But it might have opened up something in their mind where they think, but actually, maybe I do want to talk about that. So the next time that you try, they're a little bit warmer to the idea. And then the third time, they're ready to say, actually, I've been going through something and it's really hard. So the persistence of kind of asking twice or three times, how are you? Are you all right? How are you really? Can really help, because it shows somebody that you care as well. How to open up a conversation. It can feel tricky to know how to go in. And like I said before, you don't have to go in with a very deep and meaningful, we need to have a good conversation. Actually, you can choose a really good time and place where there's going to be no distractions. You know that no one's going to come in and there won't be anything else going on. And you can just have time with someone to use open questions. So rather than saying, are you okay? The only response really is yes or no. And it's likely that if you say, are you okay? Somebody will say, yeah, because it's their natural response. Whereas if you use an open question, that means something where you can't give a yes, no answer. So you might say, how are you feeling today? So someone has to think, well, how am I feeling? Actually, I'm feeling a bit tired or a bit miserable. So you can say, how are things? You don't seem quite yourself. How's that making you feel? And opening up the floor. So just making sure you don't shut down the conversation. And again, avoid giving your view of what you feel like is right and wrong in what you're hearing. Your goal as the listener is to really not say more than 10 words in this conversation unless they are open questions. So if you say, could you tell me a little bit more about that? Or you can just say, what exactly does that mean to you? You're not giving your view, you're not giving any judgment, you're not telling somebody what to do, because that can be very disempowering. You're just letting them keep talking, keep the conversation flowing, and keep them elaborating. So the key points for better listening, I always remember the first two is because they rhyme, validation and elaboration. The most important thing that you can do when you are listening to another person is validate what they're saying to you, because in that moment, whatever they're feeling, whatever they're experiencing is real for them, and that's absolutely okay. However negative it might be, it's really hard for people to admit that they're having a really negative feeling and that they're feeling really down. But your role is to say, that's okay, it's completely okay, even if you feel awful. I wish it weren't the case, but it's okay. And I see that you feel that way, and I validate that that's what's happening in your experience right now. Let people say whatever they want to without cutting in and without judging. So it's holding somebody in a place of empathy, not judging them. And then it's about keeping them talking. People often know what's best for them. I might have my own ideas and my own advice, which works for me. It won't necessarily work for the person that I'm listening to, because we're all different. We all have our own experience. We all have our own baggage. And so it's not about going, okay, well, I'm hearing you say this, so I think that and do this. It's about giving the power back to the person you're listening to keep them talking, keep them working out, meandering their own thought pathways until they realize, actually, this is what I could do. And now that I've said it out loud, and now we've had this discussion, I think this is what I should do next. So it's allowing and encouraging that person to work out their own next steps without disempowering them by telling them what you think they should do. So it's not about advice giving. One of the biggest mistakes, I think, with listening is this need to fix. I think it comes from a good place of love and care, especially when it's someone that we know. We don't like seeing people in distress that we are friends with or who we love. It's really difficult. We want to scoop them up and say, please don't feel like this. This is really hard. I want to make it all better. But that can actually negatively have a connotation for people who are in a thought loop of low self-worth, that actually what you think they're doing is still wrong. So don't forget to knock it back. Imagine it as a game of tennis. Knock the ball back to the other person. Keep the ball in their court so they can keep talking and keep working things out. And we have these shush tips at Samaritans, which I'll go through. Oops, sorry, I've just lost the screen. S stands for show you care. H stands for have patience. U is use open questions. S, say it back. And H for have courage. The first one is showing you care. So again, showing the person that you are giving them your time, all of your energy, you're making eye contact, you've put away everything else. You're showing the person that you are there alongside them in that moment. And sometimes it's enough to be alongside that person when they're having a really hard time. So just showing that you care, telling someone you care. You can send someone a text message and say, I noticed you haven't been in work, is everything all right? No need to reply. Just want you to know that I care. H is for have patience, try again, keep trying. It could take several attempts. It might take a different way of doing things. Like I say, going for a walk is a really, really good way of naturally doing something and it not feeling confrontational, and you can walk and start talking, and eventually, because the other thing about walking or going out and doing an activity and talking is that there's a natural conclusion. It can feel daunting sometimes for people to think, I don't know what happens if I open up here, it's a bit dangerous. But if you're going for a walk, eventually you'll come to the end of your walk, there will be a natural conclusion. So if people feel more comfortable in opening up. The same with driving. Using open questions. Yeah, again, the idea to tell me more. Everything that you are doing in your conversation where you're listening to somebody is probing a little bit deeper. Tell me a little bit more. Give me a bit more how you feel about that, and just gently asking them if they have anything else that they would like to elaborate on. Saying it back. So this again is about recognizing that you're really listening. So using someone's language that they have given to you. Sometimes people might not even notice that they have said something, but you might think, oh, that sounds a bit, I'm just going to check what's going on there. So saying it back to somebody, they might have let something slip and not realized that there's any kind of connotation to what they've said, but actually it might be indicative that there is something more going on. So if you say back, oh, that sounds like it's really difficult, do you want to have a conversation about that? You're listening and you're responding to what they're saying, and they're hearing it back in a slightly new way that might make them think, okay, I do need to talk, or I do need to get further help about this. And have courage. You really can't go wrong if you listen to somebody and if you only listen. unfortunately, you can go wrong if you give advice, because it could be the wrong advice. The advice that works for me might not work for you. I've used the example of going running. I'm not a very natural runner. If I was having a really tough time and someone said, well, I know, go for a run. This worked for me. I found it really great. I might go for a run, hate every second of it. My feet hurt. I come back and I really cross because I've still got my problem and now my feet hurt. So what works for one person might not work for another. So don't give your advice and don't offer solutions. Just listen and just be there for somebody in that moment. At Samaritans, we have the idea that we work to is that we don't save other people because we believe people know what's best for them. They might just forget it sometimes, but people know themselves better than anyone else knows them. So we don't try and save people, we stand alongside them until they're ready to save themselves. And just to describe that, if you imagine somebody who is suffering in some way, or if they have depression or they're stressed, imagine that person as sitting in a big, deep, dark pit. Your initial instinct might be to go and get a ladder, put the ladder into that pit and say to that person, come on, I'll pull you up and out of that pit, put your foot on the ladder, I'm going to hold your hand and drag you up. And that is the worst thing that you can do for that person, because they know it's great and sunny and nice where you are. They're looking up this ladder and thinking, I can't ever get up it. And you saying it's great up here, come on, I'll drag you out of the pit, isn't helpful. What is helpful is you go and get the ladder, you put it down to the pit and you climb down into the pit and you sit alongside that person and you say, tell me what this feels like for you. Explain to me what this is for you. Tell me a bit more about that. And the more you talk and the more they elaborate, the more they can work through the issue until they feel ready to put their first foot on the first rung of the ladder. And then they can begin to climb out and you can be there alongside them in that moment, holding them in the safe shared space. So just letting people know that you're there can make a really, really big difference. And letting people, giving people that opportunity to say, actually, yes, I would like to talk. And then actually thinking, this is a much bigger issue than I first realized, can be a catalyst for them to think, do I need to go and do more? Is a conversation enough? Do I need to go and visit a GP? Do I need to seek out counselling or therapy or some other kind of help? Sometimes it can be difficult for people to reach out and ask for help until it's really bad. So as well as lessening the kind of stigma, if we're all checking on each other and having good conversations and listening to one another well, we can be allies when somebody is going through something tough and they know that they can come to you because you're a safe, trusted person. So that's the shush tips in a nutshell. And so I'm wondering if we can open up to questions.
Hi, Kate. Definitely. Thank you so much for that insightful session. We've got a few questions that has come out. Somebody pointed out the great Brené Brown empathy versus sympathy video, which I know that you eloquently described and referred to now. Highly recommend watching that. Somebody said as well, do you have to have any counselling skills to be a good listener?
No, but it's a very good question, because I think there's a real difference in, for example, the work that a counsellor would do or the work that Samaritans do. And what it's really important to be aware of here is that no one is saying adopt the role of a counsellor to listen to others. This is a very general how to listen to people that you know, who you work with, who are your neighbours, who you love, who are your friends. It's a general introduction. So if you think someone is struggling, somebody, you might know that they suffer from depression or stress, or they're very burnt out, and you might recognize that they need a bit of a helping hand. They need to talk about it, they need to let it all out, or they need to remind themselves that actually perhaps they need to put their action plan, in terms of getting a life balance of their own mental well-being. What this isn't is about how you respond to people with significant distress or diagnosed mental illnesses, because it's not, it's very difficult for you to try and take on a role of counsellor, because people train for years and they're dedicated professionals to do that job. Your role as a listener to people that you know, to open communication and to check in, are you all right? Because I'm just been a bit worried about you. That is to allow them to talk and focus their thoughts enough to realise if they need further help from a counsellor. So you're not taking the role of, right, okay, let's talk about trauma. That's not right for you and it won't be right for them. What it is recognising that that person might say, there's a lot going on at the moment, and just saying that out loud is making me think, I do need to get back to the doctor and I do need to work out something more for myself. So there's a very important distinction between good listening and taking on a counsellor or a therapist role, which I do not, I'm not saying that anyone should do.
Absolutely, and there's quite a few questioning actually about giving advice, because I think naturally people will find it easier to give advice rather than just listen, hear them out. So people are saying, is it okay to give them some resources, and if they ask for advice, how should we handle that?
I think if people ask for advice, then you can absolutely give it to them. You know, if someone is saying, I just don't know what to do in this situation, you can, whatever the situation is, you can work with them on what do you think might be the options available to you here. And if they say, what did you do in this situation? You can say, well, I went to see a counsellor, or I started a yoga session, or whatever it is that you might want to give your advice on. The most important thing is to not just take back the control. What you're trying to do when you're listening to somebody is give them the full control. So if they are asking for your advice, you offer nuggets of advice, but you say, what do you think about that? Do you think that could work for you? Is this something that you might like to do? Sometimes, you know, if people are in a really difficult state of mind and they do need something to hold on to, that it doesn't mean that they don't still have an awareness and can't respond to the nuggets of advice that you're giving. So it's about continually giving back the mic to that person and saying, here's what I would do. Would you like to? The danger is when you say, here's what I did, and now let me tell you all about every single bit of, you know, like, oh, you're breaking up with your boyfriend. Oh, let me tell you all about when that happened to me. And then suddenly, 2 hours later, you've talked all about yourself, and that person is still thinking, oh, I've still got my problem.
Absolutely. So again, using that open questions that you mentioned earlier on, right? The open question would help them to guide them to their own conclusion. And we've got a couple of questions, Katie. One of it is whether you can share the shush slide again, and we can do that. I don't know if you can bring that up, and then it can just stand in the background so people can have a look at it. Somebody said, is there anyone, this is a really good question, is there anyone you would admire as being a good listener or a good listening role model? I like that question.
A good role model. Do you know, it's interesting. A lot of Lauren Laverne, I know she's a really obvious choice, but when you listen to radio interviewers who have a conversation with the people who are on air, it's very different than listening to a presenter who is just telling you everything that they want you to hear. So I think, and it is quite rare, you know, it's quite rare that that's done on a major scale, because all of our public figures tend to have something to sell or to get across, have a message to get across. I mean, I personally feel like any Samaritans listening volunteer are amazing role models. They're everywhere. If you know anyone who's a Samaritans volunteer, you should talk to them about how they listen, because they are absolutely inspirational in the way that they lead a conversation down the listening route and doing also. I hope people can see the shush tips back there now. They are online as well. It's a really good question, actually. I think I'm going to have a good think about who my listening role model is.
It's a very good question. And absolutely, as you say, there's Samaritan volunteers are all very, very good at that and know how to do so.
Yeah.
There's a good question coming in. Following up on the question about giving advice, that is definitely one of the person who's asked the question's natural instincts. Do you have some tips to hold yourself back from slipping into the counsellor mode?
Yeah, I think it is very natural to most people to go straight into giving advice and to fall into that, especially when it's somebody that we know, because like I say, quite a lot of the time, you know people, so say you live with somebody, you know their behavior really well, and if they're suffering, it's really, really hard to be aware of that and not to go straight into, I'm going to scoop you up, I'm going to make everything better, I'm going to fix this, because seeing you like this is so painful that I can't cope with it. So I'm going to make it better for you. But do you see, like, that's suddenly all about me again. It's not about that person. So it's about really breaking it down and keeping the pauses and the silences, and not being afraid. If you asked somebody a question that was slightly probing, like, oh, I noticed that you hadn't been coming along to our weekly netball game. Is everything all right? I just wanted to check in that there's something going on. Don't be afraid to leave that gap and leave it with that person who might think, no one's asked me that before, and actually, is there something going on? And they need to formulate that thought process. And rather than starting to psychoanalyze why you think they're not coming, you can just leave the pause until they're ready, or you can ask them open questions. So they're not saying, oh, yes or no. So it's not kind of, what you don't want it to become as defensive, because if you say, oh, I think that you're really depressed, that person could be defensive and say, well, I'm not actually, I'm completely fine, and I don't appreciate that you're telling me what I'm feeling, because that's disempowering to that person. The place that you want to get to is, even if you skirt around the topic for a while, you can ask people, how have you been feeling recently? Or is everything okay? Are you sure everything's all right? Do you know that I'm here for you if you ever want to talk? Because if there is something you want to talk about, I'd really like to support you in that, or I'd like to support you to get help if you feel like it's needed. But it's about open questions and gently probing the things that that person says. So not imparting I think you should do this, this is what I think is wrong, but letting them bring it to you.
Absolutely. There's a few more questions around whether this session will be recorded, and it is. So you can have the recorded session afterwards. You'll receive an email about it, so you can watch it all again. People are also asking if we can watch videos of how Samaritans do it. There's not any videos available of that, but there's lots of information on Samaritans' website, which is samaritans.org. One of the tips I use as a Samaritan listener is, what happened today to make you feel like you're feeling now? That often is a good opening question. There's also somebody who said, what if? And I think this is interesting, because I think we've all had a lot on our plates recently. This will probably be one of the last questions we go through. What if you feel like you're not in the best position to listen to someone else's issue? For example, you have a lot going on yourself, or your own mental health is not very good. How should that be handled without letting the other person down too much? A really valid question.
That is really valid, and I think it's really important, because actually self-protection is incredibly important here. And the logic of it is that really, if you are suffering, you're not going to do a very good job in listening to someone else and being there for them, because you'll be very preoccupied with how you're feeling. So it's not going to do you any good. It's not going to do the other person any good. The way I kind of describe this to people is, if you imagine a sponge, a bath sponge, that when it's dry, it's really, really light, natural sponge. You can throw it around and it practically floats. It's really, really light. If you put it in water, it gets completely soaked and full of water. And the longer that you leave it in the bath, it sinks to the bottom. It gets completely overwhelmed with water, and it's just saturated and it sinks. What can we do to wring out the sponge? So if you think, when I'm taking on day-to-day stresses, work, relationships, money, kids, family, friends, everything that's going on, I take on water, and suddenly I'm saturated. If I'm at the bottom of the bath, completely saturated, I have nothing left. I can't take on someone else's water. I can't take on their issues, can't take on their problems. I can't be there for them, because I've got too much. I'm too contained. So either we do self-protection and we have self-care first and foremost, which isn't a luxury, it is a necessity. We wring out the sponge until we are in a place where we think, right, I've managed to get balance in my own life. Now I can go and listen to that person. But it's incredibly hard to take on something and feel like you're in the role of a carer with somebody that you know without being equipped. So people shouldn't feel guilty about saying, I don't think I'm the right person to listen. You can always refer that person and say, have you thought about talking through this with a friend, with a doctor, with a Samaritan? You can say to them, I think it would be great for you to talk about this, but no one should ever feel guilty about saying, I am not the right person to listen, because if I do, I'm going to take on too much and that's going to be detrimental to me. It's absolutely okay to say, this person definitely needs to be heard and I recognise that, but I'm unable to do that at the moment.
Absolutely. Absolutely great advice to end on. I love that analogy about the sponge. It's a very, very good way of saying it. Somebody's actually commented, the last comment I'm going to read out is that they remember something that a colleague once told them that never left them. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth and use them in that order. And that's very, very correct. So I just thank you, Katie, for the very, very useful presentation. It's thought-provoking. Do you want to remind people of the Samaritans number, just in case?
Yes, it's 116123, and we are available 24/7.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Katie. I really appreciate your time. I just wanted to thank all our sponsors as well, Allen & Overy, Northern Trust and GSK. I hope that you all had enjoyed the webinar. Just to remind you, you will receive an email within 24 hours, which includes a recording of this webinar. And that's all left for me to say. So thank you, Katie, for the insightful session, and have a lovely afternoon, everybody. I'm now going to end the webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.